Well, hello, hello, hello. Much love to you all. May God bless you all. Hit that like button. We're at the book of Judges Explained. See, the book of Joshua was full of great success, which was the last explained series we did. The tribes of Israel had been unified under strong leadership and had successfully conquered the promised land. Although Joshua records momentary lapses, such as in chapter 7, the sin that had happened, the book emphasizes on Israel's success in taking and dividing the land. But this period of great national victory was short lived. The swift and miraculous conquest was followed by a longer period of time in which Israel seems to have lost its moral compass. During this period, approximately 2 centuries, Israel continually sinned against God and broke his covenant. The chosen people of God seemed determined to embrace the forbidden Canaanite religion and to depend on their own ability to defend themselves from the enemy nations. Lacking a strong national leadership, we see that in Judges 17, verse 6, and Judges 21, verse 25, and unwilling to trust God, the nation was morally bankrupt and seemingly unconcerned about its state of affairs. Joshua had entered in the promised land with ease, but the next period of Israel's history showed that life in God's land would be far from easy for his people if they persisted in their sins. So, really, there's two historical books that cover this period. It's the book of Judges and the book of Ruth. We'll do those separately. So, these central characters of this narrative are called the judges, or as the Hebrew word shaphat. And it's not just how our English word implies the word judges. No, these judges were charismatic military leaders who God raised up and empowered them for specific task of deliverance in order to restore justice. The book of Judges chapter 2:16 says, "Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them." Notice it says those that spoiled them. See, the office implied governing in a broad sense. These 12 judges were local and national heroes who became military rulers endowed by God to lead the nation into victory against particular enemy nations. I'm going to have pop up on the screen a little outline of a breakdown, and then I'll be back. So the center of the book is, of course, found in Judges chapter 2, verse 6, all the way to Judges 16, verse 31. And it's a collection of stories about the judges who ruled Israel from the death of Joshua to the rise of Samuel. We see an introduction is in the beginning from Judges 1, verse 1, all the way to Judges 2, verse 5. And we see the book closes from chapter 17, verse 1 to 21, verse 25, detailing episodes that occurred during the judges' period, but which do not relate to a specific judge, as chapter 2, verse 6 to 16:31 is all about in particular judges. So we get the introduction here in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 5. And the book opens up with the phrase, "after the death of Joshua," which bears an important historical and theological function here. It marks both the end of the previous period under the success of Joshua and the beginning of a new era in Israel's history. In contrast to the conquest and the occupation of the promised land, this new period of Judges is a time of disobedience and failures. This introductory chapter, it gives supplement to the book of Joshua and gives more details about the nature of the conquest. Joshua emphasized a unified Israel invading and conquering the promised land. This was appropriate to the purpose of that book, but Joshua also made frequent references to the need for individual tribes to complete what they had been told to do corporately. You see this in Joshua 13, 1 through 13, Joshua 16, verse 10, Joshua 17, verse 12 through 13, and verse 16 through 18, and chapter 18, verse 2 through 4. The book of Joshua presented a picture of the great military victory, but an incomplete conquest. While Judges chapter 1, verse 1 to Judges 2, verse 5 describes the limited success of individual tribes, Judah and Simeon experienced measured success initially, but they were not able to drive out the inhabitants of the territory allotted to them, as Judges 1, verse 19 says. Several other tribes were also unable to gain victory over the Canaanite inhabitants of the land. This prepares us for the rest of Judges by informing us that the Israelites lived side by side with the pagans that they were not supposed to, and that they were warned that they would be a snare to them and that they would follow after these pagan gods. So we see that it concludes this little introduction in chapter 2, verse 1 through 5, where it confirms that Israel has been disobedient and that the individual tribes have compromised with the inhabitants of the land. The remaining Canaanites in the land will plague them in the future, as Judges 2, verse 2 through 3 records. So now we get to the main body of stories from Judges 2, verse 6, all the way to Judges 16, verse 31. Israel's failure to complete the conquest was a result of the covenant disobedience and lack of faith, as Judges 2, 2 through 3 says. But the central section of the book goes on to demonstrate that this covenant failure was not a unique occurrence. Unfortunately, the covenant breaking became Israel's way of life. Now, the central section of this book has its own introduction. The author prepares for the judges by introducing three basic general facts from Judges 2, verse 6 to Judges 3, verse 6. First, Joshua's generation was now dead, and now the new generation of the Israelites had rejected God the Father, as Judges 2, 6 through 15 says. Now, the new generation worshiped Canaanite gods instead of the Lord who had led them out of Egypt. It's no different than today's world, too. They think they're following God, but they're not following God. So the Lord became angry and allowed enemy nations to afflict them, as Judges 2, 13 through 14 says. Second, when the people repented, the Lord raised up judges to deliver them. Judges 2, 16 through 23. But after the judge died, Israel relapsed back into sin and idolatry and worshiping other gods, as Judges 2:19 says. So, third, because of their failure to complete the conquest, the Israelites now live among other nations in the promised land. Judges 3, 1 through 6 talks about this. These nations were a military threat, and not just a military threat, but a threat on their obedience to God. So, these pagan beliefs came amongst them. And we see that the historical cycle described from Judges 2, verse 6 through Judges 3, verse 6 became the pattern for Israel's life. They referred back to sin instead of following the Lord. And the Lord gives them over to an enemy nation. And then the Lord sends a judge to deliver them. But the nation falls back into sin. We see this constantly throughout it. It talks about sin. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. It talks about war's judgment. The Lord sold them into the hands of whatever enemy nation it was talking about for X amount of years. And we also see that repentance came. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord, what? Deliverance. He raised up for them a deliverer. X, the name of the judge, whatever judge it was, as we see many of them rise up, and they were saved. So we see that these statements are usually followed by the land had peace for X amount of years while the judge was alive. And we see at least a pattern 6 times from Judges 3, verse 7 to Judges 16, verse 31 that highlight 6 particular judges. Othniel in Judges 3, verse 7 through 11. Ehud in Judges 3, 12 through 30. Deborah in Judges 4, verse 1 through Judges 5:31, Gideon in Judges 6, verse 1 through Judges 8:28, Jephthah in chapter 10, verse 6 through Judges 12, verse 7, and Samson in Judges 13, verse 1 through Judges 15, verse 20. In addition to these six major judges, we see that there is few details about the careers of six, I guess you could say, minor judges. Shamgar in chapter 3, verse 31, Tola in Judges 10, verse 1 through 2, Jair in Judges 10, verse 3 through 5, Ibezan in chapter 12, verse 8 through 10, Elon in chapter 12, verse 11 through 12, and Abdon in chapter 12, verse 13 through 15. The judges are by no means portrayed as holy individuals, you could say. They were just temporary leaders raised up by God to deliver his people. Some are worthy of some huge look upon, like Deborah, you could say. But we see like Japheth, he apparently had little conception of Yahweh's requirements, and Samson's faults are renowned. And as a rule, these judges illustrated God's grace and mercy for his people, but they are not necessarily examples of devotions to God. So we get to the last five chapters of Judges, where it portrays a age of anarchy and lawlessness. And there's two horrible episodes that are recorded in the end here: Micaiah and the migration of Dan in Judges 17 and Judges 18, the rape of the Levites' concubine, and the intertribal war from Judges 19 to Judges 21. So we read about all this idolatry, conspiracy, senseless violence, and sexual acts. These chapters do not present a chronological history of the period. Rather, they portray what life was like during the time the judges were there when they had no king. There's this repeated phrase: in those days, Israel had no king. In Judges 17, verse 6, Judges 18, verse 1, Judges 19, verse 1, and Judges 21, verse 25. So, really, we look at it, it's just also there was really nobody that was abiding in the love of the Father. They weren't listening to the commands. They kept building their own gods. Things kept happening. So, like the introduction that we see in Judges chapter 1, verse 1 through Judges 2, verse 5, these chapters show Israel's failure to live the covenant relationship with God. The introduction looks back and compares the Judges to the period preceding the success under Joshua. These narratives look forward to the time of a monarchy when the line of David would provide peace and security. Of course, there was none in this time. There was no king in Israel. That's why it repeats it so much. And that's also it. We see anarchy because there was no firm leadership that was going on in the land of Israel at the time. So the narratives are different from the central section of the book. And we see from Judges 2, verse 6 through Judges 16:31, Israel was afflicted by external enemies who oppressed them in military actions. But in chapter 17 through 21, the problem was internal. And that's actually not just Israel's own worst enemy. That's our worst enemy, is the internal problems we have. So we see that there's this also another repeated phrase throughout the book of Judges, that all the people did what was right in their own eyes and what is actually wrong in God's eyes, you could say. And we see that there is an order that is needed to be taken place. Morality was at an all-time low in Israel's time during this time. And we see that the author of Judges had this external standard for the Israelite society, was they needed to have a king. And of course, in the Christian faith, we know that there's only one true king, and we know that is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. So we see through all this time They say that the book of Judges, it yields about a period of 410 years. Pretty decent amount of time. Lots of up and down periods of time throughout this time as well. But we also see that there's a need for a political structure here. Reason why they had no king that was ruling over them. They had judges that kept coming up. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There needed to be a political structure. And ultimately, we always point this back to Christ as the ultimate government, the ultimate politicalness that we need. He brings freedom, he brings everything. But what is clear that is in this period of ancient Israel, between Joshua and the Kings, the book of Kings, First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, First, Second Chronicles. We see that the book of Judges describes a period from Israel as a nation of tribal nomads to trying to establish a monarchy when we see David and Solomon come into the picture here. And the tradition would be a critical one for Israel because the people came under strong influence of Canaanite fertility religion, pagan gods, how Israel responded to the culture pressure to compromise its faith and to follow a heathen pagan type of religion that wasn't going to get them anywhere. Hopefully, this short Explained series helped a lot with the book of Judges. Some books have a lot more to explain. Judges is not one of those books that has a extreme a lot that we could really talk about compared to Joshua that we did or Genesis. But nevertheless, I still hope that this blessed you and maybe encourage you to read the book of Judges again, even if you've read it 3, 4, 5, 6, 20 times. Hard telling how many times you've read it, but hit the like button on the way out, and may God bless you all. You fight from victory, not from defeat, and that is thanks to King Jesus.